Goodbye, Fernando. See you when you come back.
You know, I really would like a break one of these days. How do I go from going like 2 months without making a video, and then I've now done 3 in 3 days? The timing of this is funny, but I've been motivated, so I guess that works. And hey, Sebastian Vettel's comments ended up aging like a fine wine, because here we are. I originally recorded this video last night, but I wanted absolute confirmation on it before I really went into it, and the lighting was a bit shit. So instead, I got it like this, with the sun still out. It's actually quite nice in here. But yeah, I'm cutting to the chase. Fernando Alonso is back at Renault. It was officially announced about 3 or 4 hours ago, to much fanfare on Twitter. He'll be joining Renault on a 2-year deal. He'll be replacing Daniel Ricciardo, who's obviously going to McLaren next year. That was well established before the season even started, funnily enough. Like I said, 2-year deal for Fernando, which is crazy, and I'll get to some of the reasons why later. But just breaking down some of the aspects of this deal, I find it amazing, first and foremost, that Cyril Abiteboul, that runs the team, was insistent in saying that, you know, driver salaries are getting under control, and, you know, the talk has been very heavy regarding you know, driver salaries in recent days. It's been debated a lot. Romain Grosjean had comments on it about it as well. I'll be getting to that in another video later on this week. But looking at the lay of the land at Renault right now, they are still seemingly middle of the road as a team. They weren't particularly outstanding in Austria this time around. Ricciardo retired from 10th due to a technical failure. Ocon just about got back in the points, but not particularly impressive in the process. They're still middle of the road. It doesn't help that, you know, McLaren, that's also running their power units this year, look better than them right now, and, you know, they were better last year too. So here we are. You know, if it being a 2-year deal, and with the fact that Fernando Alonso is going to be 41 by the time this contract ends, is Esteban Ocon good enough to be the guy going forward? Is he good enough to justify, you know, maybe being a guy that can spearhead and lead a team? It's hard to say. We don't know. Ocon's still relatively inexperienced for an F1 driver, even though he's had a couple of years now. He was swinging pound for pound with Sergio Perez when he was at Racing Point as teammates together, but ultimately lost his job to Lance Stroll. Again, probably not due to talent, but other reasons. Ocon's good. I'm not sure whether he's that good, you know, like the guy, you know, leading a factory team. It's a different ball game when that's your role and responsibility. But you've also got to look at the situation just below them in Renault's Driver Academy. A lot of people have been talking about that in the wake of this news, and specifically Guanyu Zhou, who's probably now one, if not the two star names that are in their academy. Saying, look, Guanyu Zhou would be great. He's a great pull. He's a fast driver. He's good enough for F1, etc., etc. He'd be a great pull for the Chinese market. Getting a Chinese driver back in the sport who could be quite good. And I agree with that sentiment. There's just one problem with that. He hasn't got a super license. That's kind of a big snag here. Like, Guanyu Zhou has 14 super license points as of this year. He has 14, which means he would have to finish 4th in the Formula 2 Championship this year in order to be eligible for a super license. The man that's actually got a much better chance of getting into Renault that way is his Driver Academy teammate, Christian Lundgaard, who has 33 super license points and only needs to finish in the top 7 to get enough points to be eligible for a Formula 1 team straight away. It would still be risky, given obviously that Lundgaard's only 19 years old, but, you know, there's an argument you could make that maybe Lundgaard's a brighter prospect than Zhou is, and even then, Formula 2 is in a really sketchy situation right now where it's just had 3 rookies come up and make the top end of the sport. I had to make this point to Chris Harris on Twitter earlier, saying, this is disappointing for guys that want to see a young driver get hired. This is not new, you know. Driver academies are a messy thing in the first place, and I'll get to some of that talk in just a minute. But it's weird to me that we're talking about it in this sort of context, because Formula 2 is in a weird spot. It's got a very nasty mix of super talented younger drivers on Driver Academy bills as it is, like all the Ferraris, Callum Ilott, Robert Schwartzman, Marcus Armstrong, that are all in there. Mick Schumacher's in there. Dan Tickton with Dams has got 35 super license points in his own right. He will probably be eligible next year if he gets in the top 7 or so. So, yeah, like, again, there's a lot of guys hovering around that eligibility range right now. And even worse still, there's a bunch of older, more experienced guys. Some guys would like to label as pay drivers, the Artem Markelovs, the Luca Giottos, the Louis Delatrasses of the world. Guys that probably aren't going to get into F1 now. It's probably a bit too far on in their careers for that. But, on the other side of the coin, they are still good enough where they can win Formula 2 races at will, and that could take points off some of the younger guys fighting for themselves. So, Formula 2 is a bit like Moto 2 in the two-wheel sense. It's a class where talent often goes to die. And that is going to be a minefield for either of them to get out of, to say the least. And that leads to a greater discussion about driver academies. And I wanted to make the point about this, because this seems to be the straw that's broken the camel's back in terms of people talking about driver academies and just how useful or not useful they actually are. Because I made this point on Twitter earlier today that, real talk, every driver academy has sinned. And I think now might be the time to start asking difficult questions about just how useful these academies actually are. Because for all the academies that there are in the sport, it seems to be more a case of hoarding talent so it isn't used against you down the road. Almost like you're betting against your own prospects. Because the bottleneck to get into the sport is still really hard. Last year was a freak year. We had Lando Norris, Alex Albon and George Russell all graduate. All of the top 3 made it. That does not normally happen. Normally it's 1, maybe 2 people graduate from the sport into Formula 1. And normally it's only if a driver jumps the queue because they're well funded and some of the lower ranking teams need the money. So, again, all this talk about for the sport being a meritocracy doesn't really hold up under further scrutiny or examination. And like I said, every driver academy you can think of has sinned or done questionable things since they've become a thing. Red Bull's mistreatment of many of their prospects has been well documented and publicised over the years, from Al Ghassawi and Buemi, Scott Speed. Okay, maybe Speed wasn't so great, but you get the gist. You know, they let Carlos Sainz walk. They messed around with Daniil Kvyat. In his career has been heavily augmented by his treatments at Red Bull. And of course, we saw Pierre Gasly get dropped after just a handful of races with the top flight team last season. Ferrari might have too many prospects in their academy right now, because how are you going to facilitate Armstrong, Schwartzman, Ilott and Mick Schumacher all in Formula 2 all at the same time? There ain't enough seats to go around. You ain't got an official B team. Yeah, I'm sure you could talk with Alfa Romeo if it came down to it and cut them some sort of deal, but you're not going to be able to look after all 4 of these dudes at once. That could be problematic. And before then, we had dudes like Vernon Gutierrez wearing Ferrari blazers, driving simulators and saying, "Hey babe, I drive for Ferrari." And that's a cool thing to have on your CV. But they were mostly just used for commercial sake. Like Esteban Gutierrez at Ferrari, the only thing I remember about him being there was him teaching Kimi Raikkonen how to say "gway" in a commercial. No, I'm not putting that clip in there again. We all saw that Mercedes even, they messed around with Pascal Wehrlein. Yeah, they got him a seat in the sport, but he never got a fair shake in Formula 1. He spent his time at Manor, struggling back there, and then he spent 1 year at Sauber before he got moved on, and they couldn't find him another seat elsewhere. Esteban Ocon couldn't get a seat after he was moved out of Racing Point for Lance Stroll. Toto Wolff lashed out at everybody else in the paddock, saying that they were cowards for not signing Ocon, but no one is obligated to hire these guys as talent. Teams have got their own plans and they're allowed to sign who they want. Renault had Jack Aitken and Artem Markelov walk out of their academy last year because they realised the academy doesn't put that much back into their careers as they thought. Even McLaren, They promoted Kevin Magnussen, then dumped him after a year for Sergio Perez. Sorry, no, they had Perez, they dumped him for Magnussen, and then they dumped him for the return of Alonso after 1 year. You know, Magnussen did 1 year at McLaren, and then he was gone. You know, Stoffel Van Dorn was probably held back by at least 1 year, maybe even 2. You know, so every driver academy has sinned. You know, everyone has been yanked around, treated more like assets rather than people, and again, it seems to be more a case of talent hoarding than actually trying to progress their drivers' careers. And that leads us to this difficult situation and the argument people are now making for Guanyu Zhou and Renault hiring, you know, Fernando Alonso. And look, I'm not denying that Fernando Alonso is still an excellent race car driver. Even though he's been out of the sport for a couple of years, even though he's 39 years old, he is still better than probably 90% of Grand Prix drivers that are on the table. I just find it confusing and hypocritical that Cyril Abiteboul was complaining about driver salaries and then spending big bucks on Fernando Alonso. He's not going to come cheap. He's Fernando Alonso. He's a massive brand. He's a massive driver. One of the most recognisable and iconic drivers of the last 15 years. This is a big deal. You think Alonso's not going to know his own worth? Especially knowing that he's only got a handful of years left and probably wants one last big payday after the Triple Crown attempts failed. You know, he probably would want one last big payday before he calls it quits. And if you wanted to cut driver salary a lot more and still keep a decent driver and have some longevity, why not give Nico Hülkenberg a call? Like, I'm not saying Hülkenberg is a better driver, but he might be a better fit for Renault's current climate. Let's not forget they have teased the idea of dropping out of the sport in recent times. I mean, okay, they're saying they're committing to 2022 in the new regulation change, which is, of course, a good thing. But there's been rumblings about their future in the sport. There's been rumblings that shareholders are unhappy, which is why they dumped Hülkenberg for Ocon in the first place. I don't know if he's even been approached about the possibility of a return, but he's only 32 years old. He's still a solid driver. He can lead midfield teams well. He did it with Sauber and Force India before. The man can drive. There's no doubt about that. And I guarantee you he's not asking for 10 million quid a year either. The Alonso move to me is just a bit of a head scratcher because, like, who does this entertain? Who does this please? Are Renault just trying to sell jackets and merchandise? Because we saw Alonso's second run at McLaren and we saw how miserable he became by the end of it, how the team got dragged down the pecking order and was becoming more and more of a struggle. And McLaren is now looked at, shall I say, like a breath of fresh air because of Carlos Sainz, because of Lando Norris, because they've got back up the order. It's a feel-good story. It's the most likeable McLaren team, I'd argue, since Mika Hakkinen was there in the 90s. You know, this is a big deal. And then you've got Cyril, who's run a Renault team the academy served next to no purpose. And this is, and I pointed this out on Twitter again earlier. He's not retained a single driver lineup since Renault came back into the sport 5 years ago. And that will go on for a 6th year because now we know Alonso is replacing Ricciardo. He's not retained a driver lineup at any point since they came back, which is a mess. And it's going to go on into 2021, and they've not promoted a single academy driver either. So what's the point? What are we doing here? No one's going to be picking up Renault power units anytime soon because they've got a bad enough reputation as it is. Alonso is grumpy, he's miserable, he's not a particularly great team leader. He dragged the McLaren team in the past into disrepute and pissed off Honda to no end when he was down there, when he was criticising their engine and brand on a regular basis. I'm not, like, if you're an Alonso fan, do you really want him back? To join a mediocre Renault team right now that's barely fighting for lower end points? Like, is this what you really want to see? You know, 2 more years of Fernando maybe picking up the odd 6th or 7th place every once in a while? I get it. You guys think he's really good and he might do enough to make the team look a bit better, but we said that about McLaren too, and that's a more modern example. I don't agree with what Jake Humphrey said on Twitter when he talked about this sport's about young, driven people. Like, I'm a MotoGP fan, for instance. I saw the brightest talent to hit the sport since Marc Marquez was 27-year-old Johan Zarco, who did 5 years in the intermediate class, and he nearly won on his debut. It's not necessarily just about trying to pump through every young 19 and 20-year-old imaginable. This is actually the youngest grid we've had in modern times. We've got Kimi Räikkönen and Lewis Hamilton as the only 2 drivers now over 35. Although I do find it a bit weird now that going into 2020, the only world champion confirmed on next year's grid is Fernando Alonso, who's been out of the sport for 2 years. It's a messy situation. I think the bottleneck of getting into the sport combined with driver academies is what's led to this discussion. Alonso is still great, I'm not denying that, but I'm not sure he's the right fit or exactly what Renault needs. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.